Welcome back. Today's episode is about anxiety and anxiety management, which most of my listeners know that I am in long-term addiction recovery, and that one of my critiques of some 12-step programs and peer programs is that everything gets wrapped and framed around my alcoholism, my addiction. I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, and that can be very helpful in reminding somebody who is at the front end of their journey that they can't drink or drug as a solution to, well, what's really needed is nervous system regulation or relief in most cases. And having anxiety is not a character flaw. So I don't know that that's really helpful either, to moralize somebody who is anxious. So I know that I have this habit where sometimes I get way too didactic and teachery with neuroscience, and I try not to do that, even though my brain just kind of goes there sometimes. But I try to leave anxious clients with a little bit of psychoeducation from what I learned, a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, but the general premise of this book is that a zebra in the wild is probably way more likely to be eaten by a lion or a predator than you are in Naples, Florida, or wherever you're listening from. But oddly enough, zebras are not wide awake in the middle of the night with their stress response on, guts twisting, forming ulcers, because they only turn their stress response on when the lion is actually chasing them. That's the only time that they turn it on. They are not happily sitting around the watering hole going, oh my God, what if we see a lion today? That's only a human thing. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. For years, I self-medicated anxiety with alcohol, probably enough alcohol to kill most people. And man, there was a lot of waking up in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, and then drinking more. That's what a sick person looking for relief does. So if you have experienced being up at 2 or 3 in the morning, laying in bed, maybe nothing's even happening, but your body is acting like something is very wrong. Heart rate going, thoughts moving, brain scanning. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is not what it's responding to. For most of human history, stress meant something immediate and physical, like you're being chased by a lion, or you're starving, or your leg was cut off, or whatever. There was a clear threat, a clear response, and then an ending. That's what our nervous system is wired for. Now, look at what it looks like today, though. Deadlines, money, maybe your partner's tone in a conversation, something that was said, something that might be said, something that has already been handled years ago, and you keep going back to it. You can sit still and trigger the same system that was designed for survival. And that's what the theme of this book is that humans often activate the stress response through thought alone. Anticipation is enough to kick everything into high gear. Your memory is enough, and your interpretation is enough. The body doesn't care if there's an actual threat of a lion chasing you. Your system can turn on with your energy mobilizing, your heart spiking, and long-term processes all get pushed aside with you sitting in emergency mode. And that system works well if an emergency is present and it's real and it's short. But the problem is, few of us are actually ever living in that kind of an actual emergency, but the stress system stays active like that all the time, and we are not wired to live in emergency stress response all the time. Now, I'm going to humanize this and do my best not to bitch about and trash an old boss that I worked for, but I want to illustrate this for you. I had a job where I was running groups 4 nights a week, and I was seeing a full caseload of clients. And I put on my schedule, I blocked off 1 hour for documentation and case management, so all the paperwork would look correct. And the owner of that practice cowardly sent me an email saying, I didn't approve this, so I deleted it. And that was it. Like, I'm your daddy. That's what I did. This is my house. You are my property. Or at least this is what I'm telling myself, right? And that line still comes back to me this day, 2 years later, thriving in my own private practice, making 4 times what I was making there, and my system will still randomly spike and turn on when I see anything related to him or his practice. A rage response, a threat response kicks on in a half second. I can feel it in my body that my guts start to move and there's a tightness, and I replay it and think about like what I should have said, what kind of boundary, like what I should have done. And that is not a memory. That's a system that is still engaged around a threat that doesn't feel resolved. And this is one of my critiques, again, of peer programs, because to just say, well, man, that's an alcoholic thing, that's not really an alcoholic thing. It's something that still needs to be resolved internally. It's a nervous system that felt threatened, and that's not a character defect. Here's what's happening here. Trigger, 1 sentence, authority overriding a clinical decision. And then there's pattern recognition, control, being overridden, not having autonomy. And the system tags that immediately, doesn't slow down and evaluate, it just recognizes the pattern and moves. There's then an activation that my body tightens and the brain starts to run different scenarios and rehearse responses. Even though the situation is over with, it's already done, the lion's already gone. But there I am, the zebra at the watering hole, playing it over in my head over and over and over again, nervous system queued up and preparing like the threat is still active. And why it stays on is because there was no conversation, there was no repair, and there was no closure. It just happened and then moved on. But the system didn't. That's the difference between something ending externally and ending internally. The body doesn't show off just because the calendar moved forward. It shuts off when the threat feels resolved. And this is where people misunderstand stress, because they think that it's about intensity, and it's not. It's about duration. When your threat system turns on, that's not subtle. It's a full reallocation of all of your body's resources. All of your energy gets pulled from storage, your blood flow shifts, and systems that don't matter right now get dialed down. So that includes growth, repair, reproduction, digestion, all of those things. So sometimes clients come in and they talk about a host of medical issues that they have. And I'm not a doctor, but in many situations, of course, I send them for a medical referral. I'm like, go check with a doctor. But at the same time, I'm like, this sounds like chronic threat activation to me. All of that gets pushed aside. And that makes sense that, you don't need to be focused on digestion or reproduction if something is actively on fire and you're being chased by a lion right now, right? You shouldn't be thinking about getting your fuck on when you're in active threat mode. But the other thing is, there's probably not even an active threat of the lion, for example. But your body doesn't differentiate that. That's the point. The stress response is generalized. Doesn't care what triggered it. Now, here's another example. This same boss, this should have been a red flag to leave right then and there, right? But several months down the road, this same boss pulled me into his office after he found out that I was working on my days off at another practice, and without clarifying questions or anything like that, I don't know what the story was that he came up with in his head, but he called me deceitful and dishonest. There was no questions, no conversation, just decided what the story was. And then he sent me home for the weekend to think about whether or not I would have a job on Monday. 4 days, no contact, no response. I had reached out to try to smooth things over, anxious, nervous system queued up for days over, do I have a job? And he just let me marinate in it. Then Monday, I see him in the morning. He nods at me, and I have to go see 8 clients. Imagine trying to sit with a client and to hold space for them while you are trying to think about whether or not you still have a job. These are the kind of people that run mental health practices, okay? After this, he calls me into his office like nothing happened. Like none of it even existed. Hands me a written reprimand on a piece of paper, total casual tone, kind of smiling like, hey, my friend, come on in. And that memory still pops up for me all the time. Now, 12-step program would say that resentment's the number one offender and I just have to let that go. But there's something that's real there because there was no closure to that threat activation. And because there was no closure conversation, sometimes that memory pops back up when there is a trigger or something that activates that neural network in the brain. So, break that down. The trigger here was an accusation, threat, and an authority person. The pattern recognition being that there was my reputation threatened, my position being judged by somebody. That's not neutral. It hits social standing, which the brain treats as very significant. And then what's the activation? Nearly immediate mental rehearsal, defending, replaying. Even though nothing is happening now, the system will get queued up like I need to respond right away. And why does it stay active? Because it feels like it's an unfinished threat. Being sent home to think about what you did, like your dad was punishing you over the weekend, man, from a biological standpoint, that's something that's still an active threat, which is why the threat response and your nervous system stays keyed up. Now, if you were to follow any of the leaders in the healing communities, Dr. Nicole LaPera, let's say, for example, or Frank Anderson, or any of these people, you'll see this common theme that all of them are on continued ongoing journeys of self-reflection, self-healing, because there's not like a one-time EMDR, you look at a light and then you're like, oh, yeah, my boss was just an asshole, and I guess that's done now. Your nervous system may still get keyed up over certain things, and that's where the ongoing work is to notice it in real time and pause and slow things back down again. But your system doesn't need a real threat to do this. And so here's another example was after leaving that guy's practice, thankfully, I worked at a group practice that truly I don't really have any gripes about other than it was time for me to move on. But there was one time that a company-wide email was sent out to 100 therapists that work at this place. And I don't know, it was a little bit snippy. It kind of had some tone in it, but it was related to something with payroll. And I got it, and I went full-blown threat activation that I had been pulled back into that old boss's office who was deleting stuff off of the schedule and calling me deceitful and dishonest and all of that crap. And I marched in to the owner of this group practice, and I said something to the effect of, you know what? I don't like being accused of something I didn't do, and I don't like the tone of this. And thankfully, this guy had been a therapist for a long time on his own healing journey and long-term recovery and everything else. And he kind of like was like, ooh, like, yeah, okay, man, okay. Like, I can see that tone didn't land well. And he's like, but that it didn't apply to you. That was just a company-wide thing. So we walked me back down a few steps. But the example of that, though, is like, it wasn't even about me. And nothing was on fire there, but the system was keyed up, scanning for threat. Because it was unresolved and because there was no closure moment with that last boss. And here's the other thing. You may not get a closure moment. So could it all have maybe been resolved if at some point, let's just say, if that boss on that Monday had said something to the effect of, hey, you know what? Last week, I felt threatened. I had interpreted whatever, and my tone was really sharp, and you didn't deserve that. That was really unfair. I'm still working on some of this stuff in my life. Probably that could have shifted everything, but there wasn't any of that, and you probably will not get that either. So if your own healing is contingent, and if you need that person to own their shit, well, that might not ever come. And that's where like boundaries and stuff is important, but I don't want to get totally sidetracked here. The point is, you can sit in a chair and run scenarios that haven't happened, might not happen, or are already over, and then the body will respond the same way. That's anticipatory stress. Humans can stress about shit that is so far into the future, but zebras don't do that. And here's what happens next. There's no natural endpoint in all of this. A zebra, when they see a lion, they run, they escape, and then the system shuts off. Maybe they have a big poop, and then they eat some more grass or whatever the hell zebras eat. But you replay it, you revisit it, you adjust it, you argue with it, you think about getting even and watching that practice burn to the ground and all that other shit. And there is no resolution point built into that loop, so the system stays on. And this happens also in smaller ways too. Like maybe you do set a boundary or you shut down a conversation and it's done. But that one line that they said sticks, and you replay it over and over and over again on the drive home. And then you adjust and sharpen it, and you think about what you should have said. That's your system still engaged. The event, 30 seconds. The response internally, 6 hours. This is not problem solving, and therapeutically, I don't even know that I would really say that that's processing. That is your system treating it as an ongoing threat. Sometimes stress is about spikes, like a big event or a high intensity moment, but most of the damage comes from a baseline of constantly scanning for threat. When you're activated all the time, and that's the point of this book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, we are not dealing with the same threats that we used to as primitive humans. We are dealing with slow accumulation, and the system wears down over time. And a major driver of that system is staying active longer than it needs to. So how do you reduce stress? Do you just like light some incense and om and meditate, or cope better, or calm down? Or do you let a sponsor tell you that you just need to let that go? That's a character defect, get in the way. All of this framing misses the problem. If the system is triggered and active all day, You don't have a regulation problem, you have an activation problem. You're trying to calm down something that keeps getting turned on. And that's why coping strategies are temporary, because they might interrupt it, but they don't resolve it. And you go right back into the same loop, the same interpretation, the same unresolved situation, and the system stays on. The input stays the same, and so the system does too. Things like this can lead to chronic depletion, because when your body is queued up all the time with this threat response on, of course you're going to feel chronically tired. You're not going to have any patience. There's no room for it because it feels like you're being chased by a lion. So of course this naturally affects everything: your sleep, your energy, your focus, your tolerance. Not in one moment of something actually being on fire, but long-term over time. So what actually shuts it off? Not thinking about it more, not finding a better explanation, not landing on a perfect interpretation, not fixing your character defects. Those all keep going. What shuts it off is completion. You do something about it. You have the hard conversation. You take the action to leave the toxic employer. You resolve what can actually be resolved, or you stop engaging with what cannot be resolved. And that's where people get stuck. They keep trying to solve things that don't have a solution, like another person's reaction or another person's tone or another person's behavior. You can think about that for hours, but there's no completion there, so your system stays active. Stopping the loop is not passive. It is noticing and pausing and going, this doesn't require any more engagement. It's already done. Not because that thing didn't matter, but because nothing that you're doing with it is going to change any of it. That's what closes it, is that awareness. And you can feel the difference when something actually closes, because you don't need to keep going back to it. It doesn't keep pulling you. That doesn't mean that you won't ever have a trigger or an intrusive thought. Those are just kind of signals. But the work is that you don't go back into it and refeed it. You just remind yourself, yeah, that did happen, and that was wrong. That was so messed up, and you left. And now you don't ever interact with that guy ever again. So what's the solution? How do you get out of the loop? It comes down to what the Stoics called dichotomy of control, or in a 12-step program, they have the Serenity Prayer. That's a pretty close adaptation about this. What's in your control and what's not? People try to solve uncontrollable problems, like somebody else's tone, or what somebody meant, or what they think about you, or how they were perceived. That keeps your stress system activated and on. Another thing that'll keep your stress system on is when something was in your control and then you didn't do something, like not having the conversation, not having boundaries, not deciding what you're doing. So, probably had I had more of a backbone to say, hold on a second, I'm willing to have a conversation with you, but I'm not willing to be called deceitful and dishonest. I think that that's really unfair, considering you don't even have all of the facts of a situation. But a lot of times when there is something like a power dynamic, we can shut down. People often stay in mental loops instead of closing them. They replay, they analyze, they rehearse, and all of these things prevent a restoration of your baseline. So your system, it's really not that complicated, because listen, if a zebra can turn it off, you can too, with your higher self and your metacognition. That's thinking about your thinking. The system turns on when something feels like a threat, and it shuts off when it feels that the threat has been handled, or when there is a clear response, and when the body returns to baseline. But the thing is that a lot of people skip those steps, or they're not aware of how to turn that off. So instead they keep thinking about it, and then the system keeps responding in a way that it's supposed to when you're actually being chased by a lion. That's the pattern. Your system doesn't need more explanation. It needs three conditions: removal of the stressor, perception of control, and restoration of baseline. Start with the first one. Removal of the stressor. Some things shut off because they're actually handled, not thought about, but actually handled. Pause and think about what you're doing next, and then allow your body to return to baseline. Most of the time, those are the things that are not happening, so your threat system stays keyed up and on all the time, not because something's happening, but because nothing told the system to stand down and to just take a breath. The lion's gone. So practicing those moments of awareness and that refocusing, that is doing the work.